So welcome, everybody, to our final developmental disabilities research clinical and research rounds for the 2024-2025 academic year. And we will end with the best, perhaps. So Agata Dzwonek is going to be our speaker today, as we can see on the slide. And then towards the end, we can talk about upcoming events. So I first met Agata, we decided 2 years ago, Agata, I think.
Yeah,
We
2, 3 years
agreed.
ago now.
Yep. And so we had as through the sort of fellowship we offer for psychiatry graduates who are interested in developmental disabilities. And since then, so we met in Toronto, and Agata came to London last September, or last July, I guess, really. And it's really been a breath of fresh air, as they say. Has been fantastic to work with, but also I would say, Agata, without wanting to boost your ego too much, I think your knowledge of things is incredibly wide, which makes a huge difference. And I think everybody who's worked with you has been really impressed by that. So Dr. Dzwonek is a citizen of the world. And although she doesn't want me to say this, it's unfortunately too bad. So Dr. Dzwonek was born in Poland, and later moved to South Africa before the age of 10, I think, and lived there for a number of years before moving to Montreal and eventually Calgary. So has been in 3 countries and speaks 8 different languages or something.
A little bit less.
Yes. So it's like, but 4 or 5 languages. And so then Dr. Zwanek did her bachelor's degree in biomedical science at the University of Calgary, and then went to medical school at the University of Ottawa, and then completed her psychiatry residency in Ottawa as well in last May. So Agata has been here in London completing a fellowship, which will be done in a week or two, and is then moving, unfortunately for us, fortunately for her, to Vancouver, where she'll be working with children and adolescents largely with developmental disabilities. And so it's yeah, British Columbia's gain is our loss here in Ontario, unfortunately. So we had asked Agata a number of months ago if she would be able to do a presentation for these rounds. And so today, Dr. Dzwonek is going to talk about the influence of social media on the perception of developmental disorders. So Agata, take it away.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Nicholson, for the generous introduction. And since everyone is still paying attention, I do want to thank Western University, Dr. Nicholson specifically, for the training opportunity here. It has been absolutely incredible and amazing. And as I've told Dr. Nicholson many times, probably the best career decision I could have made. So thank you. So this presentation, The Influence of Social Media on the Perception of Developmental Disorders, I was inspired after Dr. Nicholson's last talk at the last DD rounds in May, where Dr. Nicholson was talking about the prevalence of autism spectrum disorder and how it's increased exponentially over the last year, specifically in the last decade, and different factors that account for that. And one of the things that Dr. Nicholson hadn't talked about that I thought would have been really interesting to explore was how social media, which evolved parallel to this exponential curve in prevalence of ASD, how that's had an influence on the prevalence as well. So originally, there were some learning objectives that were set out, but actually, as I dwelled into the topic, I had to revise them a little bit. So I don't think it makes much of a difference for you guys, but we'll start with developmental disabilities. Broadly speaking, I won't get into too many details here. It's just to summarize that the DSM-5, the developmental disability section is comprised of intellectual disabilities, communication disorders such as speech production disorder, receptive expressive language disorders. It is also autism spectrum disorder. There's ADHD, attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder, motor disorders such as tic disorders and specific learning disorders, which are struggles to gain academic gains in very specific areas such as reading, writing, or math, otherwise in the context of a normal IQ. So overall, the category is very broad with multiple overlapping symptoms between each of the categories. So I'll just start with demonstrating the historical prevalence of intellectual disabilities. Obviously, developmental disorders is very broad, as you can see. So I focused on intellectual disabilities, autism spectrum disorder, and ADHD, just because those are kind of the more pertinent topics. But Yeah, the other ones are still important. It's just they won't be covered in light of the time that I have for this presentation. So intellectual disabilities, the prevalence historically has been between 1% and 2%, and that's been steady across the years. It's been steady across sociodemographic indexes, and this data here demonstrates the prevalence of intellectual disabilities for people ages 0 to 9, but there is similar data for other ages across the lifespan. So it's remained fairly consistent. As you can tell by the graph, it's fairly horizontal. This is a slide courtesy of Dr. Nicholson from his last presentation that shows the prevalence of autism spectrum disorder. Historically, in the 80s, 90s, autism spectrum disorder was diagnosed at an incidence rate of approximately 1 in 1,000, and so about 0.1%. And over the years, it has crept up to the point where in the year 2000, the rate of diagnosis was approximately 1 in 150, so about 0.67%. And then in Canada, according to Canadian statistics in 2019, the rate of diagnosis was approximately 1 in 50 children, so 2%. And in the US, it's even higher. It's 1 in 36, which is 2.76%. So this graph is quite different from the one that demonstrates the intellectual disabilities. And the Dr. Nicholson in his presentation last month spoke about the various factors that could be potentially contributing to this rise. One of them was the fact that there was increased awareness. There were a lot of DSM revisions, DSM 3, 4, 5, that expanded the criteria for autism spectrum disorder, which probably could have contributed to coupling or to including more individuals with ASD into the diagnosis. And also funding that has become available for programs that has driven up the diagnosis as well. So it was very much multifactorial. Now, I don't have the ADHD graph because I realized as I was making a presentation this morning that the statistics I had were for pediatrics, not the general population. But if you can just trust me that the graph looks very much similar in terms of its exponential kind of growth for ADHD, you'll have to kind of take my word for it. To summarize the approximate prevalence in Canada of ADHD, it's approximately 5 to 7%, higher in pediatric, slightly less in the adult population. Communication disorders are 5 to 10%, specific learning disabilities are 3.2%, and intellectual disabilities approximately 1.4%. And then the autism spectrum disorder, classically, Dr. Nicholson and I would probably argue that it's still closer to the 0.1%, so 1 in 1,000. However, if we're going to believe the Stats Canada numbers that we see, it's probably 2%. So let's talk a little bit about social media now. So this definition of social media is a broad category of genre of communications media, which enable social interaction amongst groups of people, whether they are known to each other or not, localized in the same place geographically or dispersed. And when we look at the history of social media, it's actually quite interesting. Social media has existed since, by that definition, as far back as the 70s. When we go back to email and chat, that was something that was still limited geographically to certain areas where people were, like, for instance, within a certain workplace. By 1989, the World Wide Web, or the WWW that we know today, became available, and that expanded communication globally. In 1997, 6degrees.com was the first kind of formal social media platform where people got to communicate amongst themselves worldwide. I don't know if there's anyone here on the presentation listening in today that ever had a profile on 6degrees.com, but if so, that you were a pioneer of social media. Then you might recognize some of the other social media outlets such as Facebook, YouTube, Twitter. And I put a little cell phone here because around 2005 or 2002 to 2005, I think that's when the first smartphone became available. And by 2016, most teenagers were already getting access to it. So this is just to put you on the timeline of where these things happened. So We Are Social is a global socially led creative agency that specializes in helping brands engage with audiences through social media, digital culture, and online insights. They provide really large reports summarizing the various digital trends, and those reports are available publicly through their website. So I pulled out a couple of statistics from them just to demonstrate what the major social media platforms are. So the top mobile apps by time spent are YouTube, TikTok, Facebook, WhatsApp Messenger, Instagram. And when we look at the top websites that are being served, these are Google, YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp. So all the similar giants. The cellular data traffic here shows the exponential growth in availability of cellular data across the world between 2018, where the average use was approximately 18 gigabytes, and up to 2024, which is currently at 157 gigabytes on average. The monthly cellular data consumed by average smartphones worldwide is 21.6 gigabytes. So I still remember the day when I think I had like 5 gigabytes and I was paying an arm and a leg for it. And this graph here demonstrates how many people in the world who have access to internet, whether it's through cellular data or through direct internet connection at home, how many of those users are connected to social media. So in North America, the number of individuals who are connected to social media who have internet is 79%. The global average is 94.2. And that high number is driven primarily due to the Eastern Asian countries. And the most popular platforms, based on all the data that I've kind of shown you, are Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and WhatsApp. Now I'm going to bring you to another slide. It's a little bit blurry, but this is the best quality I could find, just so that you can compare how this trend has changed from 2019. So when you look at Eastern Asia to the very right here, in the middle of the screen, it's 70%. In, for instance, South Africa, it was 38%. And then when I go back again to the previous slide of February of 2025, that traffic has increased to 96.9% in Eastern Asia and 52% in South Africa. So the Middle Africa region has experienced one of the biggest growth, but so have the Asian countries. And I also want to note that for a lot of the Asian countries, for instance, the Philippines, the internet subscriptions are so prohibitively expensive that a lot of individuals rely on social media for news. And that was one of the Philippines was an example of that. So now I want to mention the social media algorithm, which some of you may be familiar with. Basically, social media tracks everything that we do, that we interact with on the app. It tracks everything from the time that we spend watching or looking at a post, the number of likes, shares, and comments we make, the search history that we have, how many followers we have, who we are following, who we are unfollowing, how many times we are scrolling, the rate at which we're scrolling, the number of the time that we spend hovering over a post, even if we don't interact with it, and all the information pertaining to our device information, location, and activity time. So really, it's tracking pretty much everything around us. And then that brings us to something called the algorithm loop, or something that I've seen referred to as the digital dopamine. Basically, by tapping into the addictive reward system, intermittent reinforcement, and behavioral hijacking, these digital dopamine loops we get stuck in allow social media platforms to identify patterns and predict what content we'll engage with next. They do this first by observing, so we mentioned the tracking real time that we do. Then they predict what kind of content we would be most likely to interact with based on our previous behaviors. It curates a whole content specifically for us and presents it on the newsfeed. And then it basically does this in a loop, and it learns from that content, updates, and refines future predictions. And so why does this matter? Well, the algorithm loops, essentially, they are the reason why we tend to, emotionally charged or relatable content tends to be amplified and shared more often on the web. It creates echo chambers and a confirmation bias. A confirmation bias is essentially a tendency to interpret evidence as a confirmation of a pre-existing belief or theory based on the experience that we're having. It also, the algorithm loop is an incentive for creativity. however, at the cost of accuracy, in our case, clinical accuracy. So children and adolescents are particularly at risk with these algorithm loops. And some of you might have heard about the book by Jonathan Haidt, The Anxious Generation, that came out a few years ago. Jonathan Haidt argues that we went from play-based childhoods to a phone-based childhood. And as I mentioned earlier on the kind of history of social media, the 2010s correlate with the rise in social media and dissemination of smartphones. There are statistics, and I can't cite them off the top of my head, but basically, as children get older, their interaction with and access to social media through smartphones increases dramatically. And I think only about 5 years after the iPhones came out, most teens were already getting access to it. And to this day, I think the rate of youth in Canada or North America who have access to smartphones is in the high 90s. Jonathan Haidt, he connects the digital shift of teenagers interacting with these smartphones to high rates of anxiety, depression, self-harm, and suicide that we see in the child and adolescent population. The biggest criticism of this book is that there is no direct causation that can be proven. This might be all correlation. But from personal observations that I have seen in children and youth that I see in the clinic, these children who have full-time unrestricted access to their phones are severely sleep deprived. They have very low self-esteem, extreme emotional dysregulation issues. The record so far that I have found on a child's screen time phone is 92 hours per week. And that was pre-pandemic in a 13-year-old that presented with anxiety. So I certainly, causation or not, I certainly believe that this is a significant contributor. So what are the social media trends in developmental disabilities specifically? So what I found interesting when I started doing this research is that direct access from social media platforms, direct access of data, there's a typo there, from the social media platforms is limited. So Twitter, Meta, and TikTok do not publish their data. And one of the reasons, for instance, that Meta, previously known as Facebook, does not, is due to, some of you might remember, the Cambridge Analytica scandal. Basically, a lot of compromised Facebook data showed that misinformation influenced the 2016 Trump campaign. And since then, Facebook or Meta have pulled all of their publicly available data, I guess, about the content of what is being published on the social media. TikTok is very secretive as well. And Twitter used to have a lot of data available until Elon Musk took it over and he shut down all the publicly available data. So and I looked for Instagram. I don't know what the story is about Instagram. But I couldn't find any publicly available data. And so that really only left me with Google Trends. Google Trends presents data as far back as 2004. So I want to present you some of the trends that they are demonstrating. However, I will note that Google is not always used in certain countries. So for instance, China, they do have another browser that they use most popularly that is not related to Google. So some of the data and from that perspective may be skewed. So Google Trends, when I type in autism or autism spectrum disorder, demonstrates a fairly steady search rate, more or less, until about 2020, at which point the rate increases. And the highest rates of searches increase from the Anglo-Saxon countries, including North America and Australia and New Zealand, and the UK as well. This is a graph, a Google Trends graph, showing you the trends for intellectual disabilities. Interestingly enough, the country with the highest searches and interest in intellectual disabilities were in Ireland, in a place called Navan. I tried to look what was there in Navan. I mean, they have some services for intellectual disabilities, but I couldn't really find anything specific to that geographical region to explain why they were relying on, why they were peaking in terms of their searches. But this is sort of the trend. And then for ADHD, there's actually been a significant trend, not just in Anglo-Saxon countries, but in European countries as well. And you can see that kind of increase as well, also starting around 2020. So I wanted to superimpose all three because in and of themselves, they don't really give me much information. And so this is how intellectual disabilities, which you will see the flat line in yellow on the bottom of the graph, are related, sorry, the numbers of searches are related from between intellectual disabilities, autism, and ADHD. So in red, you have the search for autism, which around 2020 was taken over by searches for ADHD. And again, the when you look at the map and how the geographical areas correlate with these trends, ASD is something that is researched primarily in North America, Anglo-Saxon countries, a lot in India. But then the rest of the world is really more interested in ADHD. And then intellectual disabilities, it seems that no one really looks into it. I pulled some data from Google Trends from other countries, like just a few countries, just to see how they compare, because I did have a patient that I saw recently for a neurodevelopmental assessment for query autism from Lebanon, and I asked the mom of this patient in Lebanon, is this talk about autism just as popular? And she said, no, they don't really talk about it. According to Google Trends, about ADHD is still more popular to be researched than autism. In Greenland, for instance, ADHD is a lot more popular than autism. In Russia, ADHD is more popular than autism. And then Canada and United States share similar patterns where autism searches are more popular than ADHD searches. And then Japan actually was interesting. It was only 98% of individuals were interested in ADHD, hardly any in autism. However, there is a significant social pressure and social stigma around mental health in Japan. So I wanted to see, okay, so autism, ADHD, intellectual disabilities. Well, how does this compare to Google Trends from other more topical searches? So I looked up Trump, ADHD versus ASD versus Trump. And so in 2016, for instance, we see a huge peak for Trump. Things settled a little bit. And then you had intermittent peaks up until about 2024. So that's just to give you a perspective of how much we talk about Trump and how much we research it compared to ADHD and ASD. This is global data. And then on the very bottom, unfortunately, I kind of, that little box popped up when I took the screenshot at the wrong time. But instead of intellectual disabilities, I put in Down syndrome. So something like a more specific genetic syndrome. And so Down syndrome was actually more popular than intellectual disabilities. And it remained fairly steady, however, over the years. And around 2020, there was no increase in searches for Down syndrome. So I thought that was pretty interesting. And then curiosity got the better of me. So I still compared these trends to other topics. For instance, sex. Sex is definitely a lot more interesting to people, and people research that a lot more than anything, ADHD or autism. Similarly with God, a little bit less popular than sex, but still there. And then I wanted to plug in some other topics. So like universe on the bottom left, you will see that ADHD actually overtook searches for a universe. And then unfortunately, democracy is trailing far behind on the top right, behind ADHD and autism, along with dinosaurs and global warming. So how do these trends translate into online conversations? As I mentioned, digging into raw data from these companies is really difficult. However, I discovered that there's something called YouGov Signal. So YouGov Signal is a media monitoring and audience intelligence platform designed to track what people are talking about online, including brands, public figures, health conditions, and more across social media, search, and online content. It captures and analyzes data across multiple languages and international markets. And so YouGov publishes some data, and it pulls the data directly from social media like Twitter, and it uses something called natural language processing machinery for learning and classifying the information that it sifts through. It also is able to discuss the sentiment, whether it's positive, negative, or neutral, based on the language processing abilities that it has. And it monitors the engagement metrics such as the number of likes, shares, and comments. So it's a very interesting organization, and it is one of the world's leading public opinion and data companies that was founded in 2000, and it's often cited by like high profile media outlets such as BBC, The Economist, New York Times, and it is used in academic research. So it is a legit source of information. Interestingly enough, YouGov Signal published a report last year in 2024 about specifically ADHD, autism, and dyslexia. This report, you have to sign up for an account with YouGov, and they probably at this point have all the information that they want to mine on me just by virtue of signing up with them. But I posted the website on the bottom. If you are interested in getting the report, feel free to reach out to me. It's actually quite interesting to look through. So I posted some screenshots here of the report for you guys to kind of look at in terms of the trends. So this is just a summary of the key trends that YouGov Signal came up with in terms of these topics. So global searches for ADHD, autism, and dyslexia witnessed a significant surge overall between 2019 and 2023, and the trend is continuing 2024. There is frequent overlap in the online conversations between ADHD, autism, and or dyslexia. And critical issues raised consistently include the high volume of late diagnosis and the need for improved educational support for students with ADHD, autism, and dyslexia. And then it also talks about things like individuals with autism and or ADHD being misdiagnosed with dyslexia, or individuals with late ASD diagnosis saying that they were initially misdiagnosed with a mood disorder. So dyslexia in this case, I'm assuming means, difficulty with reading. So that is a specific learning disorder. But as I mentioned, within the specific learning disorders, there are difficulties in reading, writing, or math. So again, I'm not sure how YouGov is using this term to define all three, or just specifically dyslexia. So just to show you, for autism, the search for autism significantly increased, primarily the most growth were observed in Poland, Russia, and Australia. Canada is number 9 there, with a 200% increase in online chatter about autism between 2019 and 2020. And what's interesting about YouGov Signal is that it actually offers some affinity data. So people who engage in autism, for instance, chat online, are more likely, or 4 times more likely, to talk about electric cars, and specific car makers such as Chrysler, GMC, Mitsubishi. They're more likely to talk about Hershey's, and they're more likely to engage with bank accounts and firms, which I thought was fairly interesting. I thought hard about how electric cars and autism could be related, and I had a talk with my husband. The best theory that we could come up with is that electric cars, usually people who are worried about climate change, pollution, whether that's linked to one of the risk factors or causatory factors for autism. That's kind of the closest we could get to, but that again is just it was a mind exercise. Some of the topics of conversations in online chatter specifically pertaining to autism were also ADHD, which was the number 4 keyword, as well as kid, school, and mental health. The online demographics showed that individuals discussing autism skewed towards the female population. So about 57% of individuals talking about autism were ages 30 and above. Which is interesting because I wonder if it is young moms who are looking for answers, perhaps based on the other word searches there, kid and school mental health. I wonder if it's young moms also talking about their children, but also YouGov does mention that a lot of women are saying that they have a late diagnosis of autism, and one of the online conversation trends here is that women present differently from men in terms of their diagnosis of autism. There were a couple of studies that I wanted to cite. So Belcher and Make from 2014, they looked into what is it about ASD in particular that has drawn so much attention on the internet. And they discovered through their study that it was mostly the savant-like or exceptionally intelligent traits that were being perpetuated as high-functioning autism, and that those traits are kind of what appears in a lot of the online topics as well. A Norwegian study from 2023 associated traits like creativity and introversion and framed them as part of the ASD. So there are certain themes that come up with the ASD diagnosis that the report alludes to as well. And then let's see, what else was there here? Yeah, so I can't remember if it's on this slide or the previous one, but it talked a lot about misdiagnosis. Oh yeah. So a lot of frustration from females who were previously diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, now having been diagnosed with autism. But there's actually a lot of comments here about individuals being frustrated at the high amount of people being diagnosed with autism, people being surprised by their friends' autism diagnosis, because, as it says here, media portrayals typically depict low functioning autism. Autism searches also tend to have a higher affinity for individuals who watch Peppa Pig, House, Sherlock, Simpsons. Again, whether these are just kind of some affinities that USignal has come up with. I've certainly watched Sherlock and House, so, but I don't know if that means anything. Now, if we move on to ADHD, ADHD searches have also significantly increased. South Korea has the highest search volume for ADHD by far, and followed by Sweden and Argentina. Canada ranks number 5 in these searches. So there has been a 195% increase in online conversations between 2019 and 2023 on the topic of ADHD in Canada. The majority of the population talking about ADHD is aged 30 to 44. The 18 to 29 population is actually only 9%. And this data, I suppose, only takes into account 18 years and up. It doesn't take into account the younger sort of teenagers. So I don't really know what these young adults are researching. I have a few theories, but maybe I'll share those in a little bit. Online affinities of people who look up ADHD are things like OpenAI, Amazon, Apple. They're a lot more likely to talk about eggs online and high protein breakfast as an integral part of their day than anything else. Topics of conversation and keyword rankings, again, autism comes up, anxiety, depression, and mental health. The majority of the population talking about ADHD online are female, about 62%, and as I mentioned, aged 30 and up. Some ADHD content preferences, again, House shows up, and a few others that I don't recognize. So I think one of the top searches for ADHD symptoms was emotional dysregulation. A lot of topics covering the emotional difficulties that people feel like they have. There's a notable volume of commentators discussing the feeling of only being able to switch between quote unquote 2 modes, either hyperfocus or boredom. And this appears to lead to additional frustration as commenters struggle to control what exactly they hyperfocus on. So they also talk a lot about struggling with time blindness, so spending hours on their smartphones unintentionally, which I find interesting because the purpose of the iPhones is to have us addicted to some of these apps that are being put out there, whether that's an ADHD symptom or just a product of social media is up for debate. There is also a lot of talk about the benefits of medication. There was an ADHD medication shortage at one point, and a lot of people were talking about how that had a significant impact on their life. And there's a moderate volume of comments surrounding self-medication with caffeine, nicotine, and less frequently alcohol. I looked up on the YouGov platform if there's any data pertaining to intellectual disabilities, and this is kind of what I got. So there isn't much there. So just to summarize a couple of points from the YouGov data. So the YouGov signal trends between 2019 and 2023 for autism demonstrated a 200% increase in discussion in Canada. For ADHD, it was 195% discussion. Now, if there are any statisticians in the crowd, I do apologize. I'm probably going to do something that's a terrible mistake, but using my simple brain and very low knowledge of statistics, I just wanted to see, by curiosity, how those 200% increases in discussion correlated with increases in prevalence between 2000 and 2023 for things like autism, ADHD, and intellectual disabilities. And I realize I might be comparing apples to oranges, but this is just kind of like a curious exercise on my end. And so this is what I found. So the prevalence increase between 2000 and 2023 was 198%, again, very close to 200%. And we know that the highest spike in prevalence occurred around 2017. So that was interesting. And then for ADHD, it's about a 300% increase for children, which is a lot more than what the discussions are online. So perhaps the prevalence cannot be fully accounted for by the increase in discussion. Maybe it has to do with all the other kind of reasons that Dr. Nicholson gave to in his talk last month, but still interesting and noteworthy. So this graph from YouGov demonstrated which of the mental health disorders were most likely diagnosed in individuals interacting on social media. And so it was reassuring to see that most individuals still reported that they did not have any mental health issues. However, the top two hitters were depression and anxiety disorders. ADHD accounted for approximately 4%, and autism was 3%. So it's interesting because these percentages, are, I wouldn't say, I won't say they're too far off from the prevalence data that we have that I presented earlier in the presentation. And this brought me back to a reflection. So Edward Shorter is a historian who works at the University of Toronto. He wrote many books, amongst them a book called From Paralysis to Fatigue. And he was quoted to say, each generation invents its own ways of being ill. And so he basically argues that in his book that symptom expression changes with cultural norms and changes over time. In the 19th century, hysteria was a form of expressing psychological distress that was deemed to be socially acceptable, desirable. It's a diagnosis that people went out of their way to obtain from their doctors. And there are many other historical examples of evolving behaviors according to the quote unquote labels that have been given. What was fascinating about hysteria is that it basically disappeared in the 1930s. And other historical examples that I read about, for instance, are there was a nun in a German convent who started biting other nuns. And then there seemed to be this hysteria of nuns biting each other that spread throughout Europe in the 15th century. So that goes back pretty far, but it also demonstrates, and there are more examples from the modern day world of symptom expression, of psychological distress according to the cultural norms that we live in. So once a disorder becomes quote unquote popular or well known, people are more likely to interpret their own symptoms through that lens. And clinicians reflect and reinforce that trend. As I mentioned, during the times of hysteria in the 19th century, people, usually from higher socioeconomic status, would go and pay a lot of money to have the diagnosis of hysteria being given to them by doctors. And so this seems to be a natural way of human being historically. And what I wonder about is when we add these digital dopamine loops to the mix, what do we get? And how much does that contribute to kind of the phenomenon that we're seeing today? And I wanted to touch briefly on the notion of illness versus disease. So disease is a biological or pathological condition that can often be objectively measured, tested, or seen. And illness is a person's subjective experience of feeling unwell. And it's how a person perceives their suffering, symptoms, or disability. Psychiatry refers to disorders which are diagnosed clusters of symptoms that impair functioning, but we don't always have a clear biological marker. And so psychiatry is highly entwined with social construct of illness. Perhaps that is why psychiatric diagnoses are a lot more susceptible to go quote unquote viral online. Because these are rounds, I felt obligated to look up some studies just to back up some of what I'm trying to tell you. And there is a study that looked at TikTok and ADHD. This study looked at the top TikTok videos under the hashtag ADHD, and they found that the understandability of these videos was generally very high, 94%, very easy to understand. The actionability was actually very low, 14%. So there weren't any solutions or next steps offered to help. individuals looking up ADHD. The credibility score varied. It was the highest for healthcare providers and lowest for non-healthcare providers. And they found that approximately 55% of the content shared by non-healthcare providers produced the most misleading content. Similarly, there was a research study that looked at the information about autism on TikTok. So this study looked at content under the hashtag autism that was viewed billions of times. And the purpose was to evaluate how widespread and factually accurate autism-related information is on TikTok. The accuracy was estimated to be about 27%. The inaccuracy was 41%, and overall, a lot of the symptoms were overgeneralized in 32% of the videos. Videos by healthcare professionals were, again, more significantly accurate than non-healthcare professionals. And there were no significant differences in views or likes between accurate or inaccurate or overgeneralized videos being shared online. So essentially, it doesn't matter if it is factual or not, it still gets shared. So just to summarize those kind of two studies, what I really was hoping for was to find a meta-analysis that compared ADHD and ASD, but that's something that is lacking. It's not available. In the top ADHD and the top ASD TikTok videos, the themes that kind of arose was that ADHD was often the way it was portrayed was misleading, whereas for ASD, it was overgeneralized. And so I mentioned earlier, one of the desirable traits about ASD is this savant-like skills, these what we would call splinter skills. That's not autism globally. Of course, there are individuals who have significant strengths, but weaknesses as well. But those things kind of tend to be generalized. And what was interesting is that the accuracy rate of the videos was about similar, between 20 and 30%. So the conclusion that I have from these two studies is that clinicians and educators should become active content creators and guides, ensuring that accurate autism, and I meant to say ADHD information as well, reaches massive audiences, because these are billions of videos being shared online. Another study analyzed how TikTok portrays ASD and the concept of neurodiversity. And basically it found that entertainment promoting oversimplified or humorous portrayals of ASD was made up a significant portion of the content. The more educational and serious the video, the less viral it went. The creators were mostly white and non-healthcare professionals, and there was a large underrepresentation of ethnic minorities. This study here assessed whether autism research articles shared via social media and news outlets affected their downloads and citations. And this was interesting because it found that for every 10 Twitter shares, it resulted in 4.4 increases in downloads and a 5% increase in citations. Articles with more than one Facebook post saw 23% more downloads, and articles featured in news stories saw a 57% increase in downloads and 39% increase in citations. So the conclusions to draw from this particular study are that social and news media exposure significantly enhances research impact. And for autism researchers aiming to reach academic and community audiences, actively sharing work via social platforms and media outlets is advisable. This slide was not formatted properly, but I wanted to look for intellectual disabilities on social media. And when I looked at the Medline search and I combined intellectual disability, or the previous terminology of mental retardation, with social media, I got 16 hits, and none of them looked at the portrayals of intellectual disabilities within social media themselves. It talked a little bit about the time that individuals, maybe spent on social media, but nothing kind of similar to our discussion. What makes a post likable or go viral? So this study looked at that, and it showed that emotional interactions strongly predicted virality. Positive emotional exchanges, for instance, support received from other online members, was far more important than neutral information posts. And negative emotionally charged exchanges went a lot more viral, and there was a much higher risk of misinformation. And so the organization, reach, and use of audiovisual content had the strongest overall influence on views. So if there was a legit, for instance, WHO organization that put out some material, they had a lot more influence. However, the emotional feedback, so whether it's positive or negative, added a significant impact on top of that. And I went on YouTube myself and I put in the hashtag autism. And unfortunately, my screenshot cut off the bottom there. But I wanted to show you like the first feed that came up on the shorts. And what I found interesting, I went through all of these feeds that are here. There are only 2 videos that feature true autism. The one on the top left with the girl in the seatbelt, and the second one on the bottom left with the gentleman with the noise canceling headphones standing next to a cosplay character. The true autism on the very top left, the girl with the seatbelt, she had 764,000 views. Compare that to all the other videos there that do not feature true autism. We're looking at numbers of 12 million, 37 million, 10 million. And these are videos that are either there for entertainment, but most of them do not feature anything related to autism or contain misinformation about autism. So we talk about self-diagnosis and social media. Reasons for self-diagnosis are multiple. We have limited access to mental health services. The cost of the assessments are extravagant and not covered by insurance usually. There's an element of identity formation. That's the theme that kind of comes up from a lot of these online discussions. And it's a social expression of emotional distress. People get community validation, support online. However, there are risks of the diagnosis. There are risks because of the diluting effect. As I've spoken to many of my colleagues, the problem with autism being so broadly diagnosed is that it's essentially become the general population pool, and so it makes research very difficult. It can lead to a lot of misdiagnosis and overshadowing, which is also important. So, just some final reflections on this topic. Social media has exploded worldwide as internet access has surged. Most of the country is connected to social media in some way. Data consumption has exceptionally increased or exponentially increased in the past 5 years. And information as well as misinformation spreads rapidly, especially when coupled with emotionally charged content. The top social media platforms are currently Meta, TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, WhatsApp. However, there is very little transparency or accountability for these social media platforms. From a developmental disabilities perspective, ASD has been glorified in social media with stereotyped savant-like abilities and social quirks. Social media users prefer palatable forms of ASD portrayals rather than what we might see in the clinic. ASD and ADHD are both misrepresented in social media and clinically not factual the majority of the time. There is very little interest in actual intellectual disabilities, and there's an underrepresentation of ethnic minorities in the online currents. There has been a surge in conversation about ASD and ADHD in the last 5 years. The timelines of exponential increases in prevalence coincide with multiple factors. As Dr. Nicholson mentioned in his last rounds, these include diagnostic revisions, awareness, funding, advocacy, but also inevitably social media and access to technology. With the statistics coming out, for instance, 1 in 50 or 1 in 36 individuals being diagnosed with autism. Personally, I do feel like social media has contributed significantly to this overinflated number. It's also important to remember that social media is an unregulated business for the most part. It is a form of entertainment. It is meant to be addictive, and it is meant to be financially beneficial to the platform. And that is much more important than facts, or in our case, clinical accuracy. However, in the background of all of this, there is a natural social evolution at play that shapes the social behaviors and norms around illness and how the disorders are influenced in psychiatry. And I would argue that probably even some of the changes in the DSM diagnosis were probably partially influenced by some of these social norms. And so I've been thinking a lot about what the DSM-6 might look like. I'd be interested to hear other people's opinions. As of now, I have a few ideas, but I don't think I'm able to really structure them yet. But it is interesting, like how will the DSM-6 be influenced by the social media, the research that is perhaps not accurate because we don't have a very good sample, the knowledge, the expectations from society, how will all of that be impacted? It's important for us, however, as clinicians to stay in tune with this stuff. Social media is a vehicle for sharing research and increasing developmental disabilities visibility and clinical accuracy. It's an opportunity for us. If we were to consider how we could use it, we could couple content, factual information, with emotional content, and that we know from research could spread the information rather than misinformation. We should also think about potential training on the use of social media for clinicians and educators. I think we should be asking patients about social media exposure. Like I said, I do regularly ask the teenagers that I see about how much screen time they have. I ask the parents to show me their screen time. We talk about it. And I know that the YouGov website presented some associations, affinities, for instance, for certain brands or eggs or whatever. It might sound trivial, but it's actually things that a lot of organizations rely on to understand their clients and to better target. One example is, for instance, political parties. Political parties know that if you have, a certain type of car parked in your driveway, you're more likely to lean one way or another in the political spectrum. So these are not things that are not being exploited by other, or maybe not exploited, but these are things that are being used by other organizations. And so there is no reason why we shouldn't. Maybe we should look at whether or not someone, has a certain brand affinity in the back of our mind, kind of keep these things, keep this information. It is our responsibility, like I said, to keep our finger on the pulse of social media, its users and content, especially around mental health. And I do not think that we can fight this online revolution. We have to adapt to it. It's the can of worms has been opened, and there has been a natural human tendency towards this for hundreds of years. Social media just threw fuel to the fire. So it's there, and we have to learn how to use it appropriately. I do believe that there should be some advocacy at the government levels to raise awareness about the impact of social media on populations. Also, there should be advocacy for improved social media literacy within our society, especially for children who are entering this world, and should be taught about the strengths and weaknesses of this medium. Holding social media companies accountable for fact checking, having algorithm opt out options, and protection of the child and adolescent population. I know these things are utopic, and I don't know how realistic they are, but I think we should still keep fighting for them. And, I think at the end of the day, when people struggle, they should have access to early identification intervention programs, regardless of the diagnosis. That being said, I do think that diagnostic rigor is still important, and we should be pushing back on the TikTokification of developmental disabilities. And I do think that although we should be open to understanding how social media shapes the way individuals understand their symptoms, our job is to be clinicians. We will always be influenced by external factors, but at the end of the day, we have to listen to our patients and what they're actually trying to say when they come to us, for instance, seeking a diagnosis of ADHD or ASD, and we should still be attuned to helping them. So, in light of this technology riddled world, I asked ChatGPT to come up with a joke based on the theme, and this is kind of what it came up with. So I asked a resident what criteria they used for diagnosing autism. They said, well, I start with the DSM, then I check Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, and if they have at least 3 matching hashtag, it's confirmed. That's courtesy of ChatGPT. So with that, that's the end of my presentation.
Thank you, Agata, for that fantastic review of things. I also really appreciate the statement at the end about how we should make diagnoses about using Snapchat and things. I will have to sign up for that, I suppose, in the very near future. I also appreciate you mentioning MySpace. So for those of you who don't know, we actually have an active MySpace page at myspace.com, UWO _DDP. And it might be the last active MySpace page in the world. So we're kind of proud of that, although there's not much information there. So, one of the great things I think about this topic is it would lend itself to all kinds of questions and comments. So first of all, I just want to say that in the chat, Jason and I both put down I both added the link for the Canadian Pediatric Society guidelines on screen use in children, in preschool children, and then in school-age children. And also Dr. Ponte, who is the main author of the Canadian guidelines from the CPS, also forwarded me a link to a new website, which is healthyscreenuse.cps.ca. And so that has lots of information. And there's also handouts for parents, which are really helpful as well. All right. So Agata, I will take my prerogative since there are no other questions in a moment. But so first of all, I mean, this is really great information. And I think the suggestions you make were great, but how do we actually go about doing that? Like when you say, that social media companies should be held accountable for their information, when in fact, I think they have gone to court regularly to make sure they're not accountable for information for because of certain things. So how do you, stuff like that, how do you propose that we actually act on that?
Um, it's a good question, and maybe I'll let you know in 20 years how it's gone for
Yep.
me. But I do think that this is the process of democracy that we have in Canada. We go to our MPs, we go to the elected officials that are meant to represent us. I think having data to back us up, having the knowledge and expertise that we do to back us up as well is important. So, but it takes a crowd, it takes a movement. It's not something that one person can do. It's something that needs to be advocated for by multiple people.
Because yeah, it just seems like the genie's out of the bottle already in a lot of ways. And I think to get them to moderate certain content but not others, because really how do you define things?
Yeah. So Facebook did the fact checking stuff, I think.
But I think they've now said they're not doing that
We're
anymore.
not doing it anymore, yeah.
Yeah.
But even something like having data transparency. So for instance, up until the Cambridge Analytica scandal, Facebook did publish its data. After that, it shut it down. So even something like that, like having access to it so we can dig through that data to find trends, to understand and kind of see how our field is being shaped by the discussions online. I think even something simple like that, it would be beneficial. Right now, it's a black box. It's censored. We don't know what's happening.
All right, so your first mentor, I suppose, Paula Walsh-Bergen, first of all, had a comment, said, great topic and well covered, Agata. And then a question, how do you envision us using social media to help folks with intellectual disabilities or autism spectrum disorder connect and transition between school and the quote real world?
Using social media,
Yep.
as in the individual themselves using social media, or using social media to raise awareness about the transition.
Uh, my understanding of Paula's question, and perhaps incorrect, and Paul, if you want to raise your hand or something, if you want to answer that question directly, my understanding would be more about individuals and how, as they get older, especially, well, not especially people with intellectual disabilities, but both autism and intellectual disabilities, how could they be used to help people connect and also transition? So also thinking about people who live in more remote communities and things like that.
Mhm. One of the studies that I saw showed that actually individuals with intellectual disabilities had a lot less engagement on social media than the general population. Individuals with autism, I don't know, when I think of the kind of classic autism that we see, how much of them want to engage online, and what do they do when they do engage online with other individuals? I'm not really sure what they do. Like, is it you know what I'm saying? Like
Yep.
there's the gaming, for instance, but is someone with autism going to go and start making friends online? I'm not sure.
Well, and I suppose it depends upon the
It
severity of autism in those
depends.
people and their cognitive ability and their verbal ability.
Mhm.
That certainly I think there are some people with what we call high functioning autism. I talk about desiring friends and wanting friends, but they'd have difficulty connecting. And I
Yeah.
think for some people, the fact that it's not face to face is sometimes easier, especially people who are a
Yeah.
bit anxious. And I would wonder if we can use sort of, and I actually have no idea how Snapchat and Instagram and all those things work. But you could also it's possible to create groups and things like that to kind of like on Facebook that people can connect with and as a support group. Um,
I know that in schizophrenia they use VR, virtual reality, as a way of learning skills as well. So that could potentially be something. I don't know if there's any existing.
so, all right. So one of the psychiatrists here at CPRI, Dr. Julia Mastrangelo, raised her hand. So, Julia, I will allow you to talk. All you have to do is unmute yourself.
Lovely, thank you. Thank you for this, really interesting information. I'd never seen it quantified like that before. One thing that I was really struck with was you mentioned about like the ADHD slash, is that like a phone side effect?
Mm.
And I just feel like, I know it's an anecdote and an N of one, but I sometimes feel like I have phone induced ADHD. I certainly did not meet criteria when I was a child, but I do find that the more I use my phone, the more I could see if I wasn't, educated in the field, I could see how I might fill out an ADHD questionnaire and think, yeah, I hit all these things some of the time, not recognizing that that's because of the phone and the dopamine and the way it is, it's designed to trap us. Even people who are aware of it happening, right? Let alone maybe somebody who can't. So I don't know if you're sort of aware of any more like looking into that. I think it would be a fascinating study to see, do people who feel they meet criteria now based on an ADHD questionnaire, if you looked at their report cards and asked their parents, would they have met it as a child if they're like me and, lived before the internet was everywhere?
Yeah, so I've done some general psychiatry work on the side, and I definitely have seen like when I have adult patients who come who describe these vague sort of symptoms, anxiety, maybe ADHD, whatever, I do always get a developmental history. So that piece of the clinical interview is always there. Before I do give the diagnosis of ADHD to anyone, regardless of the results on the questionnaire, there are lots of other things too, though, that mimic ADHD. For instance, an untreated obstructive sleep apnea, right? Like that will trigger all the symptoms, I guess, of ADHD. So I regularly send my patients for sleep studies to have that assessed. There are other things like the metabolic syndrome, the diet, things like that. There are so many things. So I do consider the diagnosis of ADHD, but it's almost like a diagnosis of exclusion once everything else has been adequately investigated.
Mhm. You're right. Like it could be so many other things. And I don't feel too that this was necessarily like the focus of today's talk, but I'm really fascinated by how the public perception, where normally mental health is so stigmatized, where somehow it very suddenly flipped to it being really, really awesome and cool to have autism and ADHD. And I was wondering your thoughts on that.
Yeah, what I've noticed too, when I browse through some of the videos, like I don't have TikTok or Instagram, like I don't have those platforms. I only have YouTube and like sparingly using Facebook to communicate with specific groups. But what I did notice on the YouTube, like the kind of page that I put out, is that a lot of the content is actually entertainment based. I don't even know that a lot of it is there to actually diagnosed. But like, let's say, you'll click on something like, oh, yeah, it's pretty funny. And then you click on it again and you click on it again, and then the algorithm kicks in. And what I wonder about is even though a journey into this world of social media may start out benign and purely entertainment based, I think these algorithms are so attuned to everything that we do that over time, maybe unconsciously, not definitely unconsciously, it'll start feeding us information and somehow it'll start tapping into certain symptoms that maybe we are experiencing, like stress in the day, based on the algorithm. So I think that's one way as well that people kind of get sucked into it. And that's why, like, I've never seen an opt out option of an algorithm, right? Like, it could start out as entertainment, but then it can go somewhere very dark very quick.
So, yeah, I think along those same lines, Agata, what I was just thinking about, I think there's lots of ways. It sort of leads to all kinds of other studies, which would be fascinating. I wonder how many people who are self-identified or people who, especially teenagers, who tell a primary care physician or another psychiatrist they think they have autism, they want an assessment. I wonder how many of them have used social media to come up with that conclusion as opposed to other source of information.
Mm.
And just about what Julia was talking about with with sort of with ADHD related to screen use, that we think we see a lot of parents or people complaining about how much time their kids spend on phones. I don't yet have the courage. I'm working up to it. At the same time, to ask those parents how much time they spend on their phones, because you look at restaurants and stuff, you see lots of times where there's families where both people like at a restaurant where everybody's on their phone and they're really not talking to each other. Um, at all. And so I wonder how much of it's modeling also.
Yeah. We were just talking about that with the medical student today. Like I do ask the children to show me their screen time, and I do ask the parents to show me their screen time when everyone has phones. And you just look at it. Like you in a non-judgmental way, but you look at it, and I think a lot of people don't realize how much they have. Like I said, the record I've come across for now is 92% in a young girl. Sorry, 92 hours per week of screen time in a young girl.
So this is on iPhone, so it provides an average?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. It gives you a daily average. It gives you a weekly average too.
Yeah, so I think that's a really interesting question, and for parents, but then to compare it between kids and parents,
Mhm.
but also, although again, hard to do that non-judgmentally. All right, so Dr. Ben Goldberg had his hand raised. So Dr. Goldberg, I will if you can unmute yourself, then you're free to talk.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. First of all, I think this is an excellent review of the effect of social media on psychiatric diagnosis. And there is an organization in Canada that's responsible for the social media. That's the Canadian Radio, Television, and Telecommunications Commission.
Mm.
Bob, Dr. Nicholson is familiar with my children who are clinical psychologists, but I happen to have one son who was the vice president of Rogers and now is a consultant in telecommunication across the country. And certainly he would be the individual as to how to communicate this excellent review to the point that I think there needs to be a representative of the Canadian Academy of Child Psychiatry, whatever organization, that does have a position statement which can use your data and have it available to the Canadian Television and Communications Division. So if you want, I can send Dr. Nicholson his contact, but you can contact Canadian Radio and Telecommunications Commission. They should, at the very least, have a copy of the study that you've done because it's quite unique.
Ben, I would really appreciate it. And your son is okay with you volunteering his information?
Probably not, but
It's too late now. So yeah, if you wouldn't mind saying that to me, Ben, I can pass that on to again. I think that's a fantastic idea.
Okay.
That'd be really excellent.
Sure. I'll get back to you on that.
Okay, thank you, Ben. I appreciate that.
Thank you.
So there was a question, and then I'll come back to Sophia Lenz in a minute. But it's a comment here from Mohammed Shah Kudaruth. I apologize if I mispronounced your last name. So it's a great presentation. I got very informative. Do you think the growing reliance, this is a great question, do you think the growing reliance on social media for mental health related concerns might be linked to the lack of objective measures and reliable biomarkers in psychiatry?
Might be like, I mean, I think
Might be linked. So is there a relationship between people looking at TikTok and YouTube and Snapchat and stuff for information? Is that potentially, do you think, or what is the relationship between that and the fact that we really don't have any good objective measures or biomarkers in psychiatry?
Do you want to take that one, Rob?
Nope.
I'm not sure. I know.
Well, can you speculate?
I speculate. So there's disease, there's illness, there's a disorder, right? Like I kind of touched a little bit on that in the presentation, and I think what we're seeing in social media is a version of illness that humans tend to create over time. Like this is our way of manifesting certain symptoms depending on what era we live in. Can it be used as a marker? I'm not sure.
I would agree again, and I think part of it too, though, I think it's a really great question, but I think a lot of our criteria are somewhat vague, and I think the DSM is not meant to be just used as a checkbox. And I wonder if that's what happens, and that's sort of the difference in some ways, is to say, between knowledge and information. I heard a great quote recently said, "Information is knowing that a tomato is a fruit. Knowledge is knowing not to put it in a fruit salad." And I wonder if, 'cause especially if we think about autism, lack of relationships or difficulty in relationships, and unusual interest in things. And those are things that by themselves could apply to a huge number of people. And I think that's where clinical experience is really important. But I think it's a really interesting question. I don't know. how we go about answering, but I think it's a really fascinating question. Thank you for that, Mohammed. So the Sophia Lenz, if you want to unmute yourself, you're free to speak. Oh, sorry, my bad. You okay? Yep, go ahead.
Yes, perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you for this talk. I think it's a really important subject. I'll be fully transparent in that I'm not a clinician. I'm a master's student, but I get sent these links by my supervisor, and I love to learn about these things. I I did just want to kind of, I guess it's more of a comment than a question, but I've read a lot about how historically, marginalized groups, women, people of color have had to resort to alternative spaces to, talk about their health problems, their symptoms because of being dismissed by their doctors, not being taken seriously by their doctors. And although I do think we've come a long way with that, it is still unfortunately a thing. And so, I do think that is a piece of the social media thing. I think the algorithms maybe kind of completely blow it up, and I absolutely agree with that. And the dopamine hits 100%. But I do think there is an element of real mistrust based on these kind of historical inequities in diagnosis, um and so I do think it's an important part of the picture just to keep in part of these conversations, because I think that when people hear clinicians talk about these things and not include that piece of it, I don't think that helps to rebuild trust. And I think that that is a really important piece of what needs to be done here. And I think it is in part fueling the social media thing. But yes, really appreciate the talk. Just wanted to add that in there.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks.
Sophia, who is the supervisor you mentioned?
Dr. Danielle Barabo.
Okay. Well, say hi to Danielle for me, please.
Will do.
But no, and thank you for passing it on. But I think that these are huge questions, right? And I think that given that what we've seen in the last decade, maybe about how there's more and more questions about how females may present differently with autism, and it's not surprising in my mind, given that females, I mean, their brains develop differently from males, they're socialized differently. It's not surprising, but I don't think it was a real question until the last decade or so. But I think even before that, uh, not recently, but in the past, I would have parents come and say, they went to their family doctor or a primary care physician when their child was 1.5 or 2 and they weren't talking yet. And they were sort of told, well, don't worry about it. Boys talk later. They'll be fine.
Mhm.
And so I think a lot of things probably have been really dismissed in the past. Unfortunately, and it's hard to know whether that ever would have made a difference in terms of outcome, but I think it leaves a bitter taste in people's mouth wondering about that. So the next question we have is from Dr. Anna Gunn. She's a pediatrician at Victoria Hospital in London. And she said, that she has 2 children with a diagnosis of autism who may have what she describes as excessive screen time as, quote, regulation. But the question is, when trying to address this, especially if there are behavioral issues, and I think we see that a fair bit, the parents become reluctant to turn off stuff because they're worried about their kids getting upset. Anyway, she says recommendations for decreasing screen time have been questioned by the parents of other children. We're concerned that is where their preteen children or even teenagers, I suppose, have social relationships, which is extremely challenging in person. So the question that Dr. Guns has, how do you balance off the excessive screen time use with perhaps that being somebody's social outlet?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, the first thing that pops into mind, I think it was in the last few months, there was CBC coverage about screen time use in children used to help them regulate, and how, for instance, if a child is having a meltdown, it causes distress in the parent, obviously, and so a parent puts a tablet in front of the kid actually doesn't learn how to self-regulate through that. And I think it doesn't matter if we apply it to autism or intellectual disabilities or the general population. Like, I think that there are still certain not rules, but recommendations that would apply. That being said, yeah, quality of life is also important. And if this is an individual's, way of interacting with the world, certainly there are many benefits to it. Like, even using the tablets as a communication device, that wasn't there, I imagine, when Dr. Nicholson was starting out his career, right? So things like that have drastically improved individuals' communication with their immediate environment. There definitely is a benefit, but I think the behavioral kind of aspects, like autism or not, our brains have not evolved at the same rate as technology has. So I think that there are still some basic principles that apply to us in this day and age of technology.
And yeah, and thank you for pointing that out, Agata, about what was available when I started. I think the wheel had just been invented when I started in medicine. But I wonder if Dr. Mitchell or one of the other pediatricians has any comment upon Dr. Guns' question as well. Michelle Aponte, I think, unfortunately, has left. But Claire, if you or Jackie, who has another question, want to comment upon that, it'd be great to hear your thoughts. And speaking of Dr. Ogilvy, actually, sorry, there's Dr. Ogilvy right there. Well, okay, so why don't we let Claire go ahead. Yeah, so Claire, you're unmuted right now.
Yep. You know, I guess my comment would be that caring for kids with complex neurodevelopmental disorders is very difficult. And I think we have to give parents, you know, a lot of credit for providing the care day in, day out. And it's very easy to provide our recommendations in the office, you know, even to demonstrate that it works in an office setting, but that's different than sitting in the back of the car at the end of a long day after a week of March break, et cetera, right? So I think that would be one point. I think the other point, though, is was interesting to see the World Wide Web was 1989. So that was when my oldest child was born. And I was working in the field at the time. And the kind of kids we're talking about, they existed back then. And somehow people managed without a screen, without that iPad. So I think that's the conundrum that I'm in. I mean, there are other ways. And I guess I don't actually always see parents try an alternative, you know, before they hand over the screen. It's very easy. We all know that. For many reasons, it's easy to pick up that phone, to pick up the screen. But I think there maybe needs to be a bit more education in what the alternatives are. And there was a poster, I think, from the CPS about, you know, what to do with your kids. And it was read them a story, go outside, go for a walk, ride a bike, like all of these sort of common sense things that I think have maybe like kind of drifted away. I think, you know, we could look at lots of reasons for that beyond the availability of the screens. You know, perhaps grandparents are still working, they're less involved, you know, so there's less ideas about how to sort of entertain your child. And then I guess lastly, I would say to avoid excessive screen time for all of us, and you know, requires a lot of work. And so I think for families with kids with complex disorders, you know, you do what you can, use it judiciously, and recognize that there might be better things that have more longer term like benefit in terms of a way to distract a person than just giving them a screen that is giving them something, you know, every half second. Like I really don't think that's helpful for the brain.
Well, you know, and Claire, I wonder that, do you think that, because I think one of the many problems we had with the pandemic was that kids were at home for a year or two and really had nowhere to go, literally. And when school wasn't on, didn't have a lot to do. So I think probably used a lot of screen time because there was nothing else to do. And now I think trying to tell them now, okay, now you have to stop using your screens as much is a huge problem. And I wonder if what you're also suggesting sort of is that really we need to focus in some ways on the parents of younger children about having them not get started using these things for regulation, because once it's already started, I think then it's really hard to change.
I'll just add, having kids, you know, who are in junior kindergarten and grade 1, I was asked to sign a consent form for my 4-year-old to have access to an iPad in class. And so again, when my kids started going to school, I went on a whole mission. I got up to the school board level to challenge the fact that there are no limits and no guidelines for the teachers themselves in schools on how the technology is being used. And it was a little bit of a dead end, actually. It was disappointing. But teachers themselves, to this day, my children tell me they will use iPads and screens or whatever technology is available as a reward system at school. So yeah.
And schools, in terms of access to inappropriate material, I would say schools have been where some of my patients have had the most horrendous experiences. Like there's very little in terms of limiting inappropriate material at school if they have access to the internet. And I guess just to your point about COVID, I was thinking about this the other day. It seemed like the right thing to do, but in retrospect, I wonder if we shouldn't have been so lenient. I mean, there have been previous times where we couldn't go anywhere because of pandemics, wars, etc. And we didn't always have an iPad, and somehow people got through it. So I guess I'm just not totally buying that. But having said that, it happened, and we're kind of where we are today. So I do think the key is early guidance for young families about how much time. I say it, over and over. CPS says no more than an hour a day, and that seems like a lot to me for little kids, but for a lot of parents that seems like a big restriction.
Yep.
And then I also I'll stop talking, but I think everybody should see the show Adolescents on Netflix if you haven't already, and then you will become even more clear in your guidance to parents. Like, you can't make them do anything particular, but I think we have yet to find out the dangers of what's online.
Oh, absolutely. And I think what I often say to people, compared to what was available just generally for people our age, Claire, that it was completely tame compared to what is out there now, in terms of, well, pornography and other things like that. Frankly, it almost looks amusing what was available in the past, and how people are being warped. And it's and I was just saying to God, I was a bit disappointed to hear you say that about your kids, because the Minister of Education came out last year saying that as of September 1st, children and adolescents were not going to be able to allowed to use their phones in school. And so it's unfortunate to hear that they're actually being used as a reward for people at times now, which seems to go against that advice. So Dr. Ogilvy, who had a question, also has her hand raised. So Jack, if you want to go ahead and unmute yourself.
I will go to my question. But a really good discussion, and I think Agata, that was a really nice data crunch of what's available, and it really kind of solidified some stuff I've been wondering about. As another pitch, just on that follow-up of schools, kids are on a ton of screens, and like you, I went school and got dead ends when my kids started. And so even back to Anna's question, that's sometimes I think we've not that we know about school and the content, but kids are going through hours of the day on screens. So they're coming home, and I actually wonder, are they needing it to regulate, or actually are they already dysregulated from the screens at school, plus all the noise, call outs, and all of that stuff? That's the direction that I wonder about, actually. And, screens being used at lunchtime. And so talking to Dr. Andrea Enns and Marina Yabera around help eating and that link between screens. There's a lot to unpack there. And like you said, Rob, students can't have their phones, but there's a whole other bunch of screens. Everything's a smartboard. Everything's an iPad. It's a Chromebook everywhere they turn. So that's a lot of screen hours in a day, on top of what we can pull from their phones when we see their weekly average. So that's one piece. That's something Emma Driorden, you all know too, who is we're working together on a larger national grant. Maybe you're part of that too, but trying to pull in law and create with Tracy Valancourt and everybody to start actually starting this movement. So that might be somebody, if Agata, this is something you're kind of passionate about to get on board with or jump on.
Absolutely. Yeah. Please reach out to me. Like I said, I've been struggling with the dead end, and I was very disappointed. And I talk about it all the time.
If I could just say, Jackie, your statement there about school is exactly what Dr. Guns had. Literally, a question after this was a comment about that exact same thing. And what I wonder, outside of behavior, and as you mentioned about eating, is what is the impact on people's eyes of staring at a screen all day?
Yep.
And I think I read somewhere once that when people used to use typewriters, it was much better because you had to look away from the screen, and having two screens is better than one. But if people are staring at one screen all day and their eyes are getting dry, I just wonder what the long-term impact of that is.
Yeah, and I haven't looked at that data since COVID. When kids were on near point screens, I think we'd have to ask the ophthalmologist about the near point, far point myopia risk factor. Certainly a risk factor when you're up close for hours of a day.
But Jackie, did you want to ask the other question that you had written down here?
Sure. No, Agata just dropped off my screen.
I'm still
Oh.
here. I'm just I need to step out to with my phone to attend a kids karate competition. So I'm here. I'm available to chat.
Let me do a quick synopsis. It was more the lack of content of ID on the web.
Yes.
And I do wonder how much, symptom generalization, and even on some of our colleagues where child may come in, and the reaction is to then refer for an autism assessment. I certainly have many, many more patients and families come in saying, wondering and verbalizing, is it autism? I can't really remember the last one patient that came in, and I see 0 to 6ers saying, is this an intellectual disability in those terms? They may describe it as learning plays or so have some awareness about that. So my question is, do you think and I've actually been thinking we need more content online, more about that, about intellectual disability, a hub for information. There's no ID Speaks or ID Ontario. A quick search while you're talking pulls up for autism, pulls up autism.gov. Our, government of Canada has a website, but no such thing for intellectual disability. I think Wikipedia was the first thing that came up today. So, but with your information and your knowledge of what you've done so far, do you think ID should actually stay out of the spotlight and safer to maybe go our other channels? What do you think? Or should it be having a platform?
I think it should have a platform. I mean, even just looking at prevalence data, it is 2% of the population has it. It's important to raise awareness about it because when you go to the like the SPMI population that we see in psychiatry, a lot of them have undiagnosed intellectual disabilities, and their quality of life, their socioeconomic status, their potential is significantly hindered by that. I think absolutely there should be awareness about it. I know I've spoken with Dr. Nicholson many times about the fact that when you go onto the Ministry of Health of Ontario website, you click on autism, it gets you to the Autism Ontario program. When you click on intellectual disabilities, it reroutes you to the Autism Ontario program.
Yep.
So there are no services, and these kids absolutely need services. There's no reason why autism versus intellectual disability, should or should not have services. These are neurodevelopmental lifelong disorders. In terms of the social media aspect, I think we have entered a stage, and this is just a personal opinion, but it's very much like narcissistic, self-centered, and social media promotes that. And we want stuff that makes us feel good. And I don't think anyone wants to, research something, for instance, like I don't know how to say this, that's so it doesn't come out wrong, but essentially, like if someone researches autism, they see autism is linked with savant abilities, it's linked with all these things. Oh, that's amazing, like I have this, maybe it's not that bad, versus your IQ and your adaptive functioning fall 2 standard deviations below that of the general population. Like there's nothing great about that when people research it. So I think that's why it's not getting the attention. I think there is an opportunity with social media to raise awareness. For instance, Down syndrome. Down syndrome is a genetic syndrome with intellectual disability, highly correlated with intellectual disabilities. And there are a lot of positive campaigns. There's a lot of awareness. There's a lot of support. Like, I think it's important to turn the conversation around, and something simple like just the change of nomenclature from mental retardation to intellectual disability shows that we want to make that shift. We want to make that transition and make it, more understandable and to the general public and more acceptable, and devoid of stigma. So I think it's a long road ahead, but in combination with, again, this is where social media skills come in, and we're not taught those things. I certainly don't have time to uphold a Twitter feed or anything like that, but to be able to couple information in the way that society digests it now, which is high emotion but factual and short. I think that's the way to, one of the strategies that should be employed, and to kind of use the system as it is to deliver that information to the public to raise awareness.
Yeah, and I think it's a great question also, Jackie, and actually, so the esteemed Dr. Adrian Perry from York actually chimed in and said it's a great point about the lack of info for ID. And I think it's absolutely true. And I think the same applies to kids with significant language disorders, that there's almost nothing for parents to read about, and on the internet. And I wonder if part of it is that intellectual disability remains a very stigmatizing. That I was talking with Julie Richard, a psychiatrist at Victoria Hospital who works in the early onset psychosis program. And we were talking about this whole, people self-identifying with autism, and she pointed out, I think rightly so, that, nobody self-identifies as having an intellectual disability. Rarely do people self-identify as having schizophrenia, although it gets questioned. And I wonder if that's partly because it's stigmatizing, but also I think part of the reason that there's so much about autism, I think the parents of children with autism have been really well organized and done a fantastic job lobbying people. And I think it's made a huge difference, but it has become a bit absurd in ways about what, if you have a diagnosis of autism, and I think this perpetuates it, what services you theoretically are available, have available to you. And I think at one point in the current iteration of the Ontario Autism Program, I remember reading something, I don't know if it was online or in the news, but about how that the people developing the current Ontario Autism Program, there was some discussion about occupational therapy and whether people with autism, with a diagnosed autism, should they have priority access to occupational therapy over people with other problems. And I can't think of a good reason personally to say that. I think the priority should be dependent upon needs, not upon diagnosis. But it's as I say, that's where we are right now. Claire, did you want to say something else?
Yeah. So I just, so I do think, just back to the school issue, I do think education for schools, sort of capturing a lot of the conversation we've had today is very important. And I'm just going to share a last anecdote. So when my kids, especially my eldest, who was born in 1989, started school, did not like the movies that were being shown to keep the kids quiet. I found them kind of scary because the parents seemed to die in the first couple of minutes of these movies. It's not just Bambi, and asked to go to the library instead and was denied. And so I think we've just kind of moved on over the last, 30 years to a similar kind of situation where movies, screens, etc., are continuing to be used. So I think some of the education and directing of some of the web-based social media information should be toward teachers, because they have a huge impact, of course, on children and their development.
Yes, if I may tell a similar anecdote, Claire, my son, who was born a decade after your daughter, but when he was in grade 11 or 12, maybe at Lucas, in their French class, no, it probably would in grade 10 or 11, they were going to watch French in his French class. They were going to watch Spider-Man for some reason. And anyway, it turned out there was something wrong with the DVD and they couldn't play the French part. So they sat and watched, in French class, they watched Spider-Man in English. And I asked him when he told me this about what the educational value with regards to French there was of watching Spider-Man in English in class. The So again, I mean, obviously, I think your presentation has created all kinds of discussion. Jackie, your hand is still up. Is that because I forgot to raise it or lower it, or because you wanted to say something?
Nope, sorry, my bad.
No, it's mine. I'm sorry. Thank you. So anyway, thank you again. This was fantastic, and I think the amount of discussion, the fact that it is now 5:34 and we're still here, says a lot about how great your presentation was and how interested people were in it. And so I'm really grateful for that. I really appreciate it, and I'm grateful for you being here in London. I'm sad that you're leaving. There is also in the chat, in addition to the guidelines from the Canadian Pediatric Society, Claire Mitchell had also forwarded to me, which I think I put there for everybody now, there's recommendations for I think the American Academy of Ophthalmology regarding eye health and screen use in children to look at. So, but thank you again, and thank you everybody for attending. We had a great year, I think, and so we will rendezvous again in October. In the meantime, on September 11th, the Developmental Disabilities Program here at Western, we have our annual fall Continuing Professional Development Day, and Jacqueline Specht, who is from the Faculty of Education, I believe, here at Western, is going to be giving a talk on disabilities and education and inclusion in schools of people with developmental disabilities, but also other disabilities. And that will be in person at Victoria Hospital, but you'll hear more about that from Jason Wittes. So again, thank you, everybody. Ben, I'm sorry I didn't see you there. Did you have another comment you wanted to make? I will just unmute you here if you do.
Yes, I just got a message from my son, Mark. I'll just read it to you. Absolutely. Please give them my phone and email information. I'd be happy to help them get in touch. I can forward the paper to some of the key CRTC people he'd also like to see about writing it up for his national telecom blog. It would get some exposure on the other side of the Ottawa River, the policymakers at Industry Canada and at Canadian Heritage.
Oh, fantastic, Ben. Thank you for volunteering that. If you could forward that to me, I will send it to Agata and others. I really appreciate it. So I don't know, Agata, if you realized what you were getting yourself into, but apparently more than you might have expected. But that's wonderful, Ben. Thank you.
It's for a good cause.
Pardon?
I said it's for a good cause, and I'm very passionate about it.
Well, I'm aware of it, which is fantastic. So again, thank you, everybody, and we will see you next fall. And have a wonderful summer. Take care.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye, everybody.